I am Sophia Brennan, and I am 28 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my father stood up in front of 30 relatives and grounded me like I was a disobedient child because I dared to ask what my grandmother left me in her will. The entire room laughed. My face burned so hot, I could feel my pulse in my teeth. But I looked him dead in the eye and said one word. All right. The next morning, he knocked on my bedroom door, smirking. Finally learned your place, he said. Then he saw the empty room. No clothes, no suitcase, no me. Before he could dial my number, the doorbell rang, and the family lawyer was standing on the porch, trembling, holding a briefcase full of documents my father never knew existed. Mr. Brennan, he said, what have you done? Settling in with my coffee, I'm struck by how quickly the ground can shift beneath us. Moments like this remind me how unpredictable life is. Where are you watching from? And what's your favorite drink right now? I look forward to your comments. Now, to understand that briefcase, we have to go back to that boardroom in Palo Alto. To understand how we got there, you have to see where it started. Not at a dinner table, but in the kaleidoscope boardroom of the Brennan Family Foundation in Palo Alto. The room is all glass and steel, overlooking the heart of Silicon Valley, filled that afternoon with shareholders and the kind of tech elite who measure their worth in Series B funding. I was sitting at the far end of the table, an architect among titans, watching my father, Kenneth, holding court. He's the chief executive officer, a man who treats the family legacy like a private equity firm. We were halfway through a presentation on the foundation's 5-year expansion when I raised my hand. I didn't raise it like a daughter, I raised it like a stakeholder. I asked a simple question about the transparency of the probate process for my grandmother Eleanor's estate. I wanted to know why her final wishes weren't being shared with the primary beneficiaries. The air in the room didn't just turn cold. It vanished. My father didn't answer. He stood up slowly, leaning his weight on the polished mahogany. He didn't look at me with concern. He looked at me with the clinical detachment of a man about to terminate a low-performing contract. You're making a scene, Sophia, he said. His voice was that low, terrifying baritone he usually reserved for failing vice presidents. Because of this blatant disrespect, you are grounded. You will remain in your room at the estate until you have learned the meaning of humility. I sat frozen as he signaled to the 2 security guards at the door. One stepped forward and held out his hand. Kenneth didn't blink as he ordered them to revoke my access badge immediately. 30 of the most powerful people in Palo Alto watched as my company credentials were taken from my neck. My father's legal counsel shifted uncomfortably, whispering that a public termination without cause was a massive liability. But Kenneth ignored him. He thought he was untouchable. I looked at him and said, "Thank you, Kenneth. You just handed me a wrongful termination suit on a silver platter in front of 30 witnesses." A few people chuckled. My brother Tyler leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered across his face. He'd always been the golden son, the chief financial officer who could do no wrong. He'd always been the golden son, the CFO who could do no wrong, while I was just the gardener, his nickname for my work as a high-end systems and landscape architect, where I integrated complex digital servers into luxury estate designs. The laughter echoed off the glass walls, a rhythmic reminder of my place in his hierarchy. I felt that familiar burn start at my sternum and climb to my temples. I looked at the 30 faces mocking me, and then at my father. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I felt the pulse in my teeth, but my mind was already moving to the next line of the balance sheet. All right, I said. It was the last time I would ever speak to him as a subordinate. I didn't cry in the elevator ride down from the glass boardroom. I didn't ask the security guards for a moment to say goodbye to the people who'd just laughed at my humiliation. By the time the clock hit 2 a.m, the silence of the Victorian estate felt heavy. But for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. I sat on the edge of the twin bed in the wing I'd lived in since I was 5 and opened my laptop. This wasn't about a daughter's hurt feelings. It was about assets and liabilities. For 5 years, I had been the architect of the Brennan Family Foundation's digital presence. I'd built their design servers and project management systems from scratch, coding until my eyes burned in the middle of the night. I'd done it all for free, a silent investor in a version of family that didn't actually exist. I'd spent thousands of hours creating the visual language for their sustainable initiatives, foolishly thinking I was building a shared legacy. Now, I realized it had been a subscription service, with me footing the bill while they enjoyed the premium features for nothing. The heat in my teeth had turned into the cold, metallic taste of a plan coming together. No more noise, just precision. I began clicking through the administrative panels. One by one, I revoked the administrative privileges I'd granted to Kenneth and Tyler. I watched the progress bars move with the same detachment I used for a landscape zoning permit. By 2:03 a.m., the Foundation's most valuable creative assets, the blueprints, the branding, the 5-year master plans were locked behind a firewall they didn't have the skills to penetrate. Access denied. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in a decade. I packed my life into 3 suitcases. I didn't linger over old photographs or the trophies Tyler had won that I'd been forced to polish. I only took what was mine. My clothes, my books, and the drafting tools I'd bought with my own paychecks from the side jobs they never knew I had. I moved through the dark hallway like a shadow, the familiar smell of mahogany and expensive floor wax failing to trigger any sense of belonging. I walked into my father's study, his throne room of mahogany bookshelves and leather-bound law. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't an apology for questioning the will. It was a copy of my $75,000 student loan statement, the exact balance of the debt Kenneth had watched me carry while he handed Tyler $200,000 for a crypto fund that evaporated in less than a month. I placed the document exactly in the center of his desk, where he'd be sure to see it before his first cup of coffee. I set my spare house key on top of the paper, the cold brass, a final punctuation mark on a failed contract. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and tonight, I was officially closing the line of credit. I walked out of the heavy iron gates just as the Silicon Valley fog was beginning to settle over the Palo Alto streets. The world was cold and grey, but for the first time in 28 years, I could breathe without permission. I didn't look back at the Victorian house in the rearview mirror. I wasn't running away. I was restructuring. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Why stay? People always ask that about toxic contracts or failing ventures. From the outside, my silence looked like submission. To Kenneth, it looked like I'd finally accepted the junior role he'd assigned me the day I was adopted into this family. But it wasn't weakness. It was a long-term investment in a legacy they were too blind to value. I've lived in a house of mirrors for 28 years, a place where Kenneth Brennan's mood determined the gravity of the room. Growing up, I learned that dissent carried a heavy surcharge. If I spoke up, my resources were throttled. If I thrived independently, I was erased from the family narrative. This is what I call the invisible chain of the survivor. It's a specialized kind of psychological architecture where the prisoner becomes the guard. You stay because you've been conditioned to believe the world outside is a void, and you're the only one keeping the walls of the home from collapsing. While my father was busy incinerating the Foundation's liquidity on ego-driven ghost acquisitions, and while he was gifting Tyler $200,000 for a crypto fund that was nothing more than a digital house of cards, I was the one keeping the lights on. Kenneth liked to talk about Brennan excellence at $3,200 dinners, but he was drowning in his own poor management. Last October, during a cash flow freeze, he refused to admit to the board the property taxes on our Palo Alto Victorian fell into delinquency. The city was 2 days away from placing a lien on the only thing in this world that still felt like it belonged to me: my grandmother Eleanor's legacy. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for an explanation. I just opened my personal accounts, the ones fueled by the landscape contracts he dismissed as gardening, and I paid the $45,000 tax bill myself. That $45,000 was my entire emergency fund, every cent I'd saved from years of independent contracts. I chose to save my grandmother's legacy over paying off my own debt, a sacrifice Kenneth never even bothered to notice. I did it quietly, without a receipt for him to see, because I wasn't saving his position. I was protecting the heritage he was too arrogant to read the fine print on. For 5 years, I've been the architect of scraps, building a sanctuary out of the silence they mistook for consent. I've been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their subscription to Power while they overdrafted my compassion daily. Kenneth thought he was grounding a child. He didn't realize he was insulting the woman who had effectively become his financial safety net months ago. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a forensic audit, and the Brennan men were about to find themselves bankrupt. Kenneth Brennan doesn't handle market shifts well, and he certainly doesn't handle a vacancy he didn't approve. The next morning, he marched to my wing of the Victorian estate with a sneer already fixed on his face. He knocked twice the same judicial, expectant knock he used when he was about to deliver a lecture on his version of gratitude. "Finally learned your place, Sophia?" He barked through the wood. When he didn't hear a response, he let himself in with his spare key. I wasn't there to see the look on his face, but I can imagine the precise moment his internal balance sheet hit zero. He didn't find a daughter waiting in tears. He found a room that had been professionally decommissioned. No clothes, no suitcase, no me. The only thing left on the twin bed was a heavy, suffocating silence, and that photograph of my grandmother Eleanor placed face down on the nightstand like a final punctuation mark. He would have walked into his study next and seen the $75,000 student loan statement sitting in the center of his mahogany desk. It was a receipt for every time he told me I was a burden while he bankrolled Tyler's latest fantasy. Kenneth didn't reach for his heart. He reached for his phone. The text came through at 9:41 a.m. It was clinical, transactional, and entirely devoid of remorse. "You're making a scene, Sophia," it read. "You have 24 hours to return and apologize to Tyler for your disrespect in the boardroom, or I will officially erase you from this family and this industry." Seconds later, my brother Tyler hearted the message. Kenneth didn't wait for a reply before he started his offensive. He wasn't interested in reconciliation. He was interested in a hostile takeover of my reputation. I started receiving notifications from my professional network within the hour. My father was making calls to the major firms in Atherton and Woodside, the high-end design partners I'd spent 5 years cultivating. The narrative he was spinning was surgical. He told them I was psychologically unstable, that I'd had a breakdown after my grandmother's death, and that any contracts involving me were a liability to the Brennan name. He was trying to blacklist me, to strip away the only thing I'd built with my own hands. He thought that by cutting off my oxygen, he could force me to crawl back to the spares table. I watched the notifications roll in while sitting in a small coffee shop on the edge of town. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't send a frantic email defending my sanity. I just pulled up my own files. My father expected a scream, but I was preparing a diagnosis. It wasn't just clinical anymore. It was an autopsy of his career. Kenneth Brennan had spent 28 years teaching me that power is about control. But he'd forgotten one fundamental rule of design. The foundation only holds as long as the support beams are willing to carry the weight. And I was officially off the clock. Harold Caldwell was the one man my father couldn't blacklist. He was the man who had spent 40 years drafting the fine print for the Brennan family. 2 hours after my father's ultimatum, Harold met me in a quiet corner of a law library downtown. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man holding the explosive results of a forensic audit. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice a measured calm that made my father's boardroom shouting seem amateur. "Your grandmother Eleanor was an architect of a different kind. She knew that families like yours don't communicate through affection. They communicate through documentation." He opened a heavy leather briefcase and slid a folder across the table. It was the original, irrevocable trust agreement, executed 10 years ago. $12,500,000. That was just the initial principal Eleanor had set aside for me a decade ago. With the company's explosive growth in Silicon Valley, that 35% stake wasn't just a legacy. It was a controlling interest worth more than Kenneth's entire personal portfolio. That was the corpus of the fund Eleanor had carved out for me. But it wasn't just cash. It was strategic positioning. Harold explained the mechanics of the trust with the surgical precision of a high-stakes merger. Irrevocable means exactly what it sounds like. It is a locked contract. Kenneth, acting as trustee, had tried to pick the lock. Harold showed me the automated system alerts from the previous month. My father had filed a quiet petition to amend the beneficiary designation, attempting to swap my name for Tyler's to cover his son's crypto losses. But the system had triggered a fiduciary breach warning. My father had treated my inheritance like a slush fund, violating every legal and ethical duty he owed to the estate. And then Harold dropped the lethal detail. This trust didn't just hold cash, it held 35% of the voting shares in the Brennan Family Foundation. I sat there, looking at the numbers. My father currently controlled 51% of the board votes, but 35% of those were tied to the trust Eleanor had left for me. If Kenneth was removed as trustee for his financial misconduct, his majority didn't just shrink, it evaporated. He had been shouting at me in a boardroom where he was technically a minority shareholder without my consent. This wasn't a family drama anymore, it was a corporate coup. Kenneth thought he was cutting off my heir, but he was actually drowning in a sea of his own legal liabilities. I looked at Harold and then at the signatures on the documents. The Brennan men had spent years assuming I was too passive to read the terms and conditions of my own life. They were about to find out that I was the only one who had mastered the fine print. Harold didn't stop at the trust agreement. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of papers, the results of a deep title search on the Victorian Heritage House. This was the finisher, the kill shot. While my father was busy trying to blacklist me from the design world, Harold was documenting a felony. He laid out the timeline with cold, mathematical precision. 2 years ago, while my grandmother was being treated for early onset dementia, my brother Tyler had her sign a power of attorney. He didn't do it to help her manage her care. He did it to use our Victorian estate as collateral for an illegal offshore crypto fund. My brother hadn't just made a bad investment. He had forged a signature on a government document to gamble with a house he didn't even own. And Kenneth knew. Every forensic audit Harold performed pointed to the same conclusion. My father had been aware of the forgery for months. He had actively covered up Tyler's criminal fraud to protect his own image as a high-powered CEO. He chose the illusion of a perfect dynasty over the reality of his son's theft. I stared at the documents, but I didn't feel the sting of betrayal. That would have required an emotional investment I'd already liquidated. This wasn't a family secret anymore. It was a balance sheet of criminal liabilities. Tyler had committed a crime, and Kenneth was an accessory after the fact. They had used the very foundation of Eleanor's legacy as a bargaining chip for their greed. Harold looked at me, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the dim light of the library. "They're bankrupt, Sophia," he said. "Not just financially, morally. They've breached every contract that matters." I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single ounce of regret. But there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was accounting. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for 28 years, and now the bill was due. The Brennan men had spent decades treating me like a liability, but as I looked at the proof of their crimes, I realized I was the only one in the room with a positive balance. I closed the folder. It was time to return to the boardroom. Fact by fact, number by number, I was going to dismantle the kingdom they thought they'd stolen. I stood outside the glass boardroom in Palo Alto, the afternoon sun reflecting off the steel and glass in a way that made the building look like a fortress. I waited for the exact moment the discussion turned to the foundation's future expansions, the moment when Kenneth's sense of absolute authority would be at its peak. I walked in without a badge, without an invitation, and without the hollow fear that had defined my posture for 28 years. The front desk tried to stop me, but they forgot one thing. I was the architect who designed the building's security encryption. My physical badge was gone, but my digital ghost still held the keys to every elevator in the tower. The conversation died instantly. Kenneth stopped mid-sentence, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson as he registered my presence at the far end of the table. He didn't look at the files in my hand. He looked at the 2 security guards by the door and pointed a trembling finger. "Remove her immediately," he barked, his voice vibrating with the same clinical condescension he had used to ground me just days before. "Sophia is not stable, and she has no business in this building." The guard stepped forward, but I didn't move. Behind me, Harold Caldwell stepped into the room, his leather briefcase clicking as he set it on the mahogany table with a sound as final as a gavel. "Don't bother," I said to the guards, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "Security does not evict the owner, Kenneth." I slid a thick manila folder across the polished table toward him. 30 of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley watched in absolute silence as my father opened it. I watched his eyes scan the documents I'd activated that morning. The formal notice of his immediate removal as trustee for the Eleanor Brennan Irrevocable Trust due to documented fiduciary breach and financial misconduct. Harold placed a signed emergency injunction from a superior court judge on the table. "As of 10 minutes ago, Kenneth, your executive authority has been suspended by court order pending a full forensic audit. You no longer speak for this board or this company. You've been treating this foundation like a private slush fund to cover Tyler's criminal offshore gambles," I said. And the collective gasp from the board members was the only sound in the room. I explained to the room that by removing him as trustee, he had lost control of the 35% voting shares that my grandmother had left specifically for me. His 51% majority hadn't just shrunk. It had evaporated. He was now a minority shareholder in a building where I effectively held the controlling interest. But I wasn't finished. I pulled a final sheet from the folder and placed it on top of his high-tech expansion plan. It was a formal eviction notice for the Victorian Heritage House. It was a court-certified unlawful detainer. I'd quietly filed the paperwork weeks ago, the moment the property taxes went delinquent. The mandatory notice period expired this morning at 9 a.m. "Kenneth, you're not being asked to leave. The sheriff is already authorized to escort you out. You're not the owner, Kenneth," I said, leaning forward until I was looking him dead in the eye. "You were a tenant, living on my grandmother's grace while you mocked her legacy. Now you're my tenant, and your lease is officially up." I watched him deflate in his leather chair, a clinical study in what psychologists call narcissistic injury. This is the illusion of power that comes from an empty wallet. Kenneth had spent decades believing he was the king of Palo Alto, but his throne was nothing more than a shell company, rented with my grandmother's character. He had spent years focusing on having material wealth and public status, failing to realize that true authority is being someone with intrinsic value. When the external assets were reclaimed, the CEO mask fell away, revealing a man who had nothing left but an arrogant tone and a mounting pile of legal debt. His empire didn't collapse because of my betrayal. It collapsed because it was a facade built on a foundation of air. I turned to the board members and invited them to stay for the emergency restructuring session. Then I looked at the security guards. "Please escort the former CEO and his former chief financial officer out of the building," I said. "They no longer have access." Kenneth didn't shout this time. He didn't lecture me on his version of humility. He simply gathered his phone and walked toward the door, his shoulders hunched, finally looking his age. I sat down at the head of the mahogany table. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accounting. And for the first time in 28 years, the books were finally balanced. The fallout was swift and clinical. Within weeks, the high-tech fortress my father had built began to crumble under the weight of federal investigations. Tyler's crypto fund wasn't just a failure. It was a paper trail of fraud, forgery, and illegal offshore accounts that the authorities couldn't ignore. Kenneth lost his board seats, his title, and the respect of the elite circle he had spent 30 years cultivating. They moved out of the Victorian estate and into a modest rented condo, stripped of the material props that they had mistaken for actual power. I sat in my grandmother's study and wrote a check for $75,000 to clear my student loans in full. It was the most satisfying balance I have ever cleared. The remaining corpus of the $12,500,000 trust was used to establish the Eleanor Brennan Center for Sustainable Design. I transformed the Victorian estate from a monument of exclusion into a training hub for young architects and designers who, like me, were once told they weren't enough. Peace didn't come from the bank balance. It came from the dirt. I spent the spring on my knees in the garden, restoring the peony beds that had gone grey from years of neglect. As the first ballet slipper pink blooms opened, I realized that I wasn't just fixing a garden. I was honoring the one woman who looked 8 years ahead and saw that I was worth the effort of an irrevocable plan. I've come to realize that many of us are living in houses of mirrors, where someone else holds the remote to our self-worth. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that your silence is not a sign of weakness. It is a period of silent investment in your own truth. You are the one who builds. You are the architect of your own future, even when they try to tell you that you are just a phase. The best revenge isn't the destruction of others. It is the radical reclamation of yourself. It is building a life so bright that the shadows cast by toxic expectations simply disappear. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set your own spirit free from a contract you never should have signed. Don't let them write your story when you are the one who owns the pen. Your documents are waiting. Your evidence is real. And your value is, and always has been, irrevocable. If you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own home, or if this story of justice hit close to your heart, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know that their silence is just preparation for a better kind of noise. Subscribe for more stories of people finding the courage to take back what was always theirs. I'm Sophia Brennan, and I'm finally home.